Hey everyone! Today I'm going to be doing another video where I'm going to be using older footage, and actually it's a project that I didn't finish, so it's like a mashup of old footage and new footage because I finally picked up the project after a year and finished it. So today I'm going to be showing you guys how I made a scrap quilt and did some big stitch hand stitching to quilt it, I guess. So yeah, I tried to finish this before Penny got here, but I basically just got to the part where it's a blanket and it just needed to be quilted, which is basically stitching all over the blanket. And normally I do that with my sewing machine. I don't have like a fancy like quilting embroidery machine or anything like that, but I would just do like straight lines or whatever on my normal sewing machine. But I really like the look of the like big stitch quilting on blankets that you can get, so I thought that I would try that myself. And I thought that it would not take so long. I thought this was going to be like a weekend project to do the hand quilting. It was not. It took like a week or so of on and off hand sewing. So it took a lot longer than I thought. So yeah, I basically built the blanket and then I stuffed it away to hand quilt it later after I had Penny. And then over a year later, here I am, getting back to it. So yeah. Anyway, let's get started. You'll need fabric scraps. I did a neutral color and colorful scraps. A backing fabric. I did black. Quilt batting. A sewing machine. Technically you can hand sew this, but a machine makes it so much faster. An iron, scissors, and embroidery thread. I actually followed a quilt pattern by My Pop It Makes called the Haphazard Quilt. The idea is to use up your fabric scraps and that the pieces of fabric will all be different sizes, making the quilt look more haphazard, and it should be a quick project. But as I was cutting stuff down, I decided that I wanted it to look a bit more orderly and nice and neat, so I cut all of my fabric to be the same size and made sure everything lined up well. Well, for the most part anyway. So for me, I cut 35 pieces of the neutral fabric into 6-inch squares. Then I cut my colorful fabrics into 2.5-inch strips. So this is intended to be a scrap busting project, and it sort of was for me. I did end up getting to use a bunch of my scrap fabric that I already had, but also since I wanted more of a rainbow palette, I totally went out and bought some fat quarters to make up for the gaps in color that I had. So I actually ended up with more fabric at the end of this project than I started with. Oops. I split the colors into 4 groups: the yellow/orange/pinks, the greens, the blues, and the purples. Anyway, once everything was all cut, it was time to sew the quilt topper together. I started with a neutral square, and then I took a strip of one of the colors, cut it down to be about the same size of the square, and sewed them together, right sides touching with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And that's going to be the seam allowance that I use for the rest of this whole project. I opened the seam and kind of just pressed it with my nail to keep it open. I do go back later and iron the seams. I just find it easier to press the seams open like this while sewing so that I didn't have to go back and forth so much with the iron. Anyway, I took another strip of that color and cut it to length and sewed it along the edge like so. I basically repeated this until the colored fabric framed the neutral fabric. Ah! And here's where I got really meticulous and where this became a multiple day project for me. Like I said, I decided I wanted to make this as nice and neat as possible, so I found the center of the neutral fabric by folding it in half, matching up the neutral fabric edges, and scoring it with my nail, and then lining up the scored lines with my cutting mat, and then I cut the extra fabric along the edges to make this square 10 by 10 inches. Then I cut the whole thing in half and cut those halves in half, so then I had 4 pieces like this. I arranged them with the color edges touching in the middle, forming a cross, and then sewed them together. From here, I further trimmed them down to be 8.5 by 8.5 inch squares. I repeated this for the rest of the squares, and after sewing everything up, I pressed all of the seams open. And here they are, all sewn and cut and ready to be assembled. I decided to do a rainbow gradient going from one corner to the other, so I laid the squares down accordingly and arranged them until I was happy with the look. Then I gathered each row, pinning them together and stacking them in order. And since the orientation of the squares matter, for mine, I pinned them at the top of each row so that I knew this was going to be at the top when I went to sew the rows together. And then, you guessed it, time for more sewing. I took the first row, pinned the first 2 pieces together, and sewed. Pinned the next piece, and sewed, and so on until that row was done. I repeated this for the rest of the rows. Then, I sewed the rows together. Once everything was sewn up, I meticulously pressed all of the seams open. This took freaking forever, but I feel like it's worth it when it comes to quilted stuff. I mean, probably also for other sewn projects too, but I will always iron quilt tops before assembling the quilt. Here it is, all sewn up, and you can see that stuff doesn't line up perfectly, even after I tried so hard to measure and cut everything perfectly, but whatever. I laid out the batting, and then I spread the quilt top on top, and then I pinned the topper to the batting. From here, I didn't really want to fiddle with the pins so much, so I decided to just sew around the edges to secure these 2 pieces together. After that was done, I trimmed the extra batting off. I just cut it to be about the width of my ruler, which I believe is over 1 inch wide. It might be like 1.5 inches or so. I laid out the backing fabric, right side on the ground, and then I laid the batting and topper layer on, pinning it in place around the edges, making sure that the backing fabric is not wrinkled. It probably would have been a good idea to iron the backing fabric first, but whatever. Then I sewed around the edge again to lock these layers in place. I cut off the extra backing fabric, and initially I wanted to do a thick border using the same edge finishing technique that I did with my other baby quilt that I made, but I ended up not having enough fabric along the long edges, so I ended up trimming the backing fabric some more, basically to be the same size as the batting was cut down to. To do the edge, I folded the backing fabric to the edge of the quilt topper, and then I folded it in half again over the quilt topper and pinned it in place. Since the batting is the same size as the edging, when I got to the corners, I had to trim the extra batting so that the corners would not be too bulky. And to continue around the corners, I folded the corner in like so, and then on the next edge, I just continued folding the backing fabric to the topper, and then folding again over the topper, and it ends up making a nice clean corner like this. Once that was all pinned, I sewed the edge down, and there we go. Finally, this thing is ready to be quilted. I was tempted to just do a simple quilt stitch like I did with the first baby quilt that I made using the machine, but ultimately I decided to stick with my original plan, which was to try my hand at big stitch quilting. Initially, I was using this roll of washi tape to help me kind of space out the stitches, but I quickly abandoned that. As you'll see later, I just started to eyeball it. It's handmade anyway, so who cares if it's a little off in the stitching. That's what I tell myself anyway. So one technique that I saw that was pretty nice for hand sewing, I guess in general, you tie a knot at the end of the thread and you stick your needle in a little, maybe like an inch or so away from like where you want to start, and then poke your needle out of the starting point, and then when you pull the thread through, when the knot gets stuck, just kind of yank it a little bit to get it through the initial piece of fabric, and then your knot and all the tail of the thread is hidden inside the quilt. So yeah, I used that little trick every time I needed to start a new piece of thread, which was a lot for this blanket, but yeah. Similarly, at the end, when you reach maybe a couple inches left on your thread, you tie a knot as close to the fabric as you can, and then go back through that hole and then poke it back out a different area of the quilt, I guess, and pull it through. And the knot should go back into the inside of the quilt, and then you can't see it anymore. When I do this, I like to try to weave it up and down into the quilt batting to make sure the knot really gets secure in there. You have to do it by feel, obviously, you can't see the quilt batting, but it seems to work pretty well. This little thing that I'm wearing on my finger is actually a Japanese style thimble. I made it like years ago. Actually, I didn't even finish it. You can kind of see that the stitching is not complete all the way around, the decorative stitching. I much prefer using this style of thimble rather than the type that like slips over the tip of your finger. It's just the way that I sew. I use like the middle of my finger to push it through and stuff, and this lends itself very well to that type of sewing. On Instagram, I posted about it, and a lot of people seemed pretty interested in learning how to make one, so I thought that I would try to do that again soon. I haven't made one of these in years, so it might be me learning again along with you guys, but yeah, maybe the next one I can actually finish. So keep an eye out for that if you are interested in one of these finger thimbles. So I just continued this over and over and over again until I had this, and then it was done. I'm so happy with how this turned out. I wish that I picked it back up a lot earlier than I did, especially knowing that it was going to take a lot longer than I thought it would. But yeah, I love how it turned out. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.